dawn was slow to arrive, its light creeping reluctantly over the horizon, as if it too sensed the dread that hung heavy in the air. The sky was a dull, lifeless gray, thick with clouds that seemed to smother the sun's warmth. On the walls of Babylon, a cold wind blew, carrying with it the scent of distant fires, the promise of bloodshed. The city was unnaturally silent, the usual bustle of the early morning stilled by the tension that gripped its people. Ira stood alone atop the battlements, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the smoke rose in thin, dark columns against the sky. The Blaze Frost celestial sword rested in his hand, its blade cold and sharp as it caught the faint light of the morning. He could feel the sword's power thrumming through him, a steady, icy pulse that matched the rhythm of his own heart. But there was something else beneath the surface, something that had begun to gnaw at him since the first whispers of this new battle had reached his ears, a sense of foreboding, of dread that he could not shake. This was not the first time Ira had stood on these walls, the protector of Babylon against the might of Persia. He had faced Cyrus's armies before, had seen the fury and power that the Persian Empire could bring to bear. But today felt different. The air was thicker, the shadows darker, and even the wind seemed to carry a weight of something unseen, something malignant. He had faced fear before, had fought in battles where death lurked in every corner. But this was something else entirely. It was as if the very earth beneath his feet had begun to shift, to turn against him, conspiring with the forces that gathered on the horizon. The Blaze Frost celestial sword, which had always felt like an extension of his own will, now seemed to hum with a life of its own, as if it too sensed the coming storm. From his vantage point on the walls, Ira could see the distant movement of the Persian army, their ranks forming with a precision that belied the chaos to come. But something was different this time. The vast columns of infantry, the siege engines that had been the hallmark of previous assaults, were absent. Instead, there was a smaller force of cavalry, their numbers barely a fraction of what Ira had come to expect from the mighty Persian legions. They stood just beyond the range of Babylon's archers, their horses restless, snorting and pawing at the ground. The men astride them were clad in dark armor that gleamed faintly in the dim light, their faces obscured by helmets that covered all but their eyes. Those eyes gleamed with a cruel, mocking light as they stared up at the walls of Babylon, their lips curling into sneers of disdain. Ira's grip tightened on the hilt of his sword as he watched them. There was something unnerving about their calm, their stillness in the face of the city's defenses. It was as if they were waiting for something. But what? The answer came in the form of a single rider who broke away from the main group, his horse galloping forward to within shouting distance of the walls. He wore no helmet, his dark hair streaming in the wind, his face twisted into a sneer of contempt as he called out to the defenders above. "Ira!" he shouted, his voice carrying over the distance with a clarity that defied the wind. "Where are you, O mighty protector of Babylon? Have you fled already, like the coward you are? Or are you cowering behind these walls, too afraid to face us in open combat?" The taunt hung in the air, and for a moment, there was silence. Ira felt the eyes of his men on him, their gazes filled with anticipation, with the hope that their leader would respond in kind. But Ira remained still, his eyes fixed on the rider below. When no answer came, the rider spat on the ground, his sneer widening into a grin. "So this is the great Ira? A coward who hides behind walls, letting others die in his place. You should have stayed in the cradle, boy, for you are no warrior. You are nothing but a frightened child playing with a sword." The Babylonian soldiers lining the walls stirred at the insult, their hands tightening on their bows, their faces hardening with anger. But Ira raised a hand, signaling for them to hold their fire. He knew better than to be provoked by such words. This was a tactic as old as war itself, baiting the enemy, trying to lure them into a trap. But the fact that the Persians would resort to such crude methods told Ira something important. They were trying to goad him into making a mistake. A second rider joined the first, his laughter loud and mocking. "Perhaps Ira is afraid. Perhaps he knows that he cannot stand against us, that his precious sword will shatter in the face of Persian steel. Come out, Ira. Come out and face your doom." The taunts continued, each one more venomous than the last. The riders began to circle below the walls, their voices rising in a cacophony of insults and jeers. They cursed Ira, his lineage, his people, calling him a traitor, a weakling, a fool who had led Babylon to the brink of destruction. They boasted of the Persian army's might, of how they would crush Babylon beneath their heels and leave nothing but ashes in their wake. Ira felt the anger boiling within him, the desire to leap from the walls and silence the jeering voices with a single stroke of his sword. But he forced himself to remain calm, to think, to see beyond the taunts and focus on the reality of the situation. The Persians were up to something more than a simple frontal assault. Their tactics had changed, and that meant danger. He turned his gaze from the riders below to the distant horizon, where the rest of the Persian army was positioned. The smoke still rose from their campfires, but there was little movement, no sign of the massive force that had attacked Babylon in the previous wars. It was as if they were holding back, waiting for something. What are they planning? The thought gnawed at him, the unease growing with each passing moment. He knew better than to underestimate the cunning of his enemy. Cyrus the Great was not a man to repeat the same mistake twice. The fact that the Persian king had already suffered 3 defeats at the hands of Babylon made him all the more dangerous. Desperation could drive men to madness, to strategies that defied reason and logic. But it was not just the Persians that worried Ira. It was the silence that lay beneath the taunts, the sense of something lurking just beyond the edge of perception. He could feel it, a presence that pressed against his mind like a weight, dark and malevolent. It was as if the very air around him had grown thick with malice, with a hatred that reached back through the centuries. He thought of Ninmagus, the dark sorceress who had aligned herself with Cyrus, and a chill ran down his spine. She was out there, somewhere in the shadows, watching, waiting. He could almost sense her gaze, cold and calculating, like a predator observing its prey. She was the true danger, the force behind the Persian army's resurgence. And Ira knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that she was the architect of this new assault. But what was her plan? What was she waiting for? The taunts from the riders below grew more desperate, more vicious, as they tried to provoke a response from Ira. He could hear the frustration in their voices, the realization that their words were failing to have the desired effect. But Ira remained still, his mind racing as he tried to piece together the puzzle before him. And then, without warning, the taunts ceased. The riders fell silent, their horses shifting uneasily as if sensing something in the air. Ira watched them, his heart pounding in his chest, waiting for the next move, the next piece of the plan to reveal itself. One of the riders, the leader of the group, raised his hand, signaling to his men. They began to withdraw, their horses moving in a slow, deliberate retreat, back toward the main body of the Persian army. The leader turned in his saddle, his eyes meeting Ira's one last time. "Enjoy your last moments, Ira," he called out, his voice filled with a dark promise. "For soon, you will face the true wrath of Persia, and when we are finished, there will be nothing left of Babylon but dust and memories." With that, the riders spurred their horses and galloped away, disappearing into the distance as quickly as they had appeared. The echoes of their retreat faded into the stillness, leaving behind a silence that was more oppressive than the noise had been. Ira remained on the wall, his mind a whirl of conflicting thoughts and emotions. The tension in the air had only grown stronger, the sense of impending doom more palpable. Something was coming, something terrible, and he could feel it drawing closer with every heartbeat. He turned to the Babylonian soldiers who stood beside him, their faces drawn and pale with the same fear that gripped him. They were good men, brave and loyal, but they were also tired, worn down by the constant threat of war. The knowledge that the Persian army still threatened them, that the city's defenses could be breached at any moment, weighed heavily on their shoulders. "We hold the gate," Ira said, his voice steady, though his heart was anything but. "We do not leave the city. They want us to make a mistake, to act rashly. We will not give them that satisfaction." The soldiers nodded, their expressions resolute, though Ira could see the doubt in their eyes. They trusted him. But even trust had its limits, and as much as they believed in their leader, they knew that this battle would be different from the ones that had come before. The air was thick with the promise of blood, of a darkness that went beyond mere warfare. Ira turned back to the horizon, his gaze fixed on the distant line where the Persian army waited. His heart was heavy with the weight of the coming battle, with the knowledge that this might be the final stand, the moment when all was decided. He thought of Belshazzar, of the promise he had made to protect her, to protect Babylon. He could not fail. Not now. Not when so much depended on his strength. But even as he steeled himself for the fight to come, he could not shake the feeling that he was walking into a trap, that the Persians were playing a game he did not fully understand. The presence of Ninmagis loomed over everything, a dark shadow that tainted every thought, every decision. She was the wild card, the factor that could change everything. The wind picked up, a cold gust that sent a shiver through him. He tightened his grip on the Blazefrost celestial sword, the cold metal biting into his palm, grounding him, reminding him of his purpose. Whatever the Persians had planned, whatever darkness Ninmagis had unleashed, he would face it head-on. He would protect Babylon, no matter the cost. As the first light of dawn began to break through the clouds, casting a pale glow over the city, Ira knew that the time was near. The battle had not yet begun, but the die was cast, the pieces in motion. He could only hope that he was prepared for what was to come. And so he waited, the silence stretching on as the sun climbed higher in the sky, the tension building with every passing moment, the calm before the storm, the quiet before the world exploded into chaos. In the distance, the Persian army began to move, a slow, deliberate advance that sent a ripple of fear through the hearts of those who watched from the walls. The time had come. Ira took a deep breath, his gaze never wavering as he prepared to face the darkness that awaited him. The battle for Babylon was about to begin, and he would be its defender, its last hope. But even as he readied himself for the fight, a part of him knew that this battle would be unlike any other, that the forces arrayed against him were not just men, but something far more sinister, far more dangerous. The frost and the fury. The horizon bled with the first light of dawn, casting a pale, sickly glow over the desolate landscape beyond the walls of Babylon. The tension that had simmered in the city through the night had reached a boiling point, each heartbeat of its people sinking with the silent dread that filled the air. On the battlements, Ira watched with cold, calculating eyes as the Persian soldiers began to retreat in apparent disorder, their ranks crumbling into a chaotic scatter as they pulled back from their initial taunts. From his vantage, the scene was almost surreal. A vast army that had once stood as a solid, menacing line now devolved into a confused mass, horses whinnying and men shouting as they turned their backs on the city. There was no sign of Cyrus the Great among them, no rallying cry, no commanding presence to draw them back into formation. It was as if the very backbone of the Persian force had shattered, leaving them to flee like a hunted pack. Ira's eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering in his mind. It was too easy, too sudden. Yet the sight of the disordered retreat fanned the flames of his warrior's instinct. The opportunity to strike, to push back the enemy, and perhaps end this war once and for all, was too tempting to resist. His breath misted in the cold morning air as he turned to the soldiers gathered beside him. Their faces, though hardened by years of warfare, bore the same mix of uncertainty and eagerness that churned within him. They trusted him, followed him without question. But even trust had its limits. The decision he was about to make could lead them to victory or to their doom. "We pursue," Ira commanded, his voice resolute, slicing through the morning chill like the edge of a blade. "We will not let them escape. They retreat because they are broken, and we will finish what they started." A murmur of agreement rippled through the ranks of Babylonian soldiers, their hands tightening on their weapons as they prepared to follow their leader into what they hoped would be the final charge. Ira wasted no time. He swung himself onto the back of the black iron horse, feeling the cold, dark power of the steed beneath him, a power that had become an extension of his own. The city gates groaned as they were pulled open, and with a roar, Ira led the charge out of Babylon. The ground thundered beneath the hooves of the black iron horse as they galloped across the barren plain, the wind whipping at his face. The Blaze Frost celestial sword clutched tightly in his hand. Behind him, the Babylonian soldiers followed, a wave of steel and determination that surged out to meet the fleeing Persians. But as they neared the retreating army, something shifted. The disarrayed mass of Persian soldiers began to part, moving to the sides with a precision that belied their earlier panic. A deep, gut-wrenching realization began to dawn on Ira as the center of the Persian force peeled away, revealing what had been hidden behind them. A wall of ferocious beasts stood waiting, their eyes glowing with a predatory hunger that sent a shiver down Ira's spine. Lions, tigers, leopards, and other wild creatures, beasts of legend, summoned from the depths of the earth by the dark power of Ninmagus, stood ready to pounce. The air around them crackled with the unnatural energy of magic, a tangible sense of menace that had been crafted with one purpose: to destroy. Ninmagus's trap had been sprung. The beasts did not wait. With a collective snarl that shook the ground, they surged forward, a wave of fur, teeth, and claws that rushed toward Ira with terrifying speed. The ground itself seemed to tremble beneath their charge, and the once clear air was filled with the sounds of their growls and the thunder of their paws. Ira barely had time to react before the first of the lions was upon him. He drew the Blaze Frost celestial sword in a swift, practiced motion, releasing a wave of cold energy that rippled outward, freezing the air as it passed. The cold blast struck the leading beasts, slowing their advance, but not stopping it. Their eyes glowed with an unholy light as they pressed forward, undeterred by the frost that began to creep over their bodies. Two lions reached Ira first, their massive jaws snapping shut on his arms with bone-crushing force. Pain lanced through him as their teeth sank into his flesh, but he fought through the agony, swinging the Blaze Frost celestial sword in a wide arc. The blade, imbued with the power of ancient ice, sliced through the air, and a sharp crack echoed as the cold intensified, freezing the lion's maws shut even as they bit into him. Black Iron Horse, sensing its master's peril, reared up with a furious neigh that echoed across the battlefield. Its hooves, harder than iron and colder than the deepest winter, came down with devastating force, striking the beasts that dared to approach. The ground beneath the horse's hooves cracked and froze, sending a shockwave of ice through the earth. The surrounding beasts hesitated, their predatory instincts at odds with the unnatural cold that now seeped into their bones. But hesitation was not retreat, and the beasts soon recovered, their numbers swelling as more joined the fray. They encircled Ira and the Black Iron Horse, their snarls filling the air, their eyes fixed on the man who had become their prey. Each of them was stronger, faster, and more relentless than any creature of the natural world, and they knew only one thing: the will of Ninmagus. Ira fought with everything he had, the Blaze Frost celestial sword slashing through the air with a speed and precision born of desperation. Each swing of the sword released waves of cold that thickened the air, forming layers of ice around him and his steed. The ice was a defense, barrier against the onslaught of claws and fangs that sought to tear him apart. But for every beast he struck down, more took its place, their bodies pressing in closer, their eyes burning with the desire to rend him limb from limb. The cold was his ally, but it was also his curse. The frost that emanated from the sword grew more intense with each strike, until the very air around Ira was thick with freezing mist. The beasts began to slow, their movements sluggish as the ice crept over their bodies, seeping into their flesh. Some of them broke away, retreating from the unbearable cold, while others succumbed to it entirely, their bodies freezing solid before shattering into fragments of ice. But still they came, driven by a force that cared nothing for self-preservation, nothing for the lives of the creatures it commanded. Ira's arms ached from the effort of swinging the sword, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the battle wore on. Blood from the lion's bite dripped down his arms, freezing in midair as it fell to the ground, creating a macabre trail of crimson ice. Despite his best efforts, the numbers were overwhelming. The beasts had him, and the Black Iron Horse surrounded, their ranks seemingly endless, and the cold, as potent as it was, could not hold them at bay forever. A tiger lunged at Ira from the side, its claws extended, its jaws wide. He barely managed to bring the sword up in time, the blade cleaving through the creature's outstretched paw and sending a spray of blood into the air. The beast howled in pain, but it did not retreat. Instead, it pressed forward, determined to take him down even at the cost of its own life. More beasts followed, their attacks coming in a relentless barrage that forced Ira to retreat step by step. The Blaze Frost celestial sword carved through them, leaving a trail of ice and death in its wake. But the sheer volume of attackers was too much. They were like a tide, a force of nature that could not be stopped, only delayed. As he fought, Ira became aware of a terrible silence behind him, a silence that spoke of death, of defeat. He risked a glance over his shoulder and saw the truth, a truth that sent a chill deeper than any frost through his heart. The Babylonian soldiers who had followed him out of the city were gone. Their bodies lay strewn across the battlefield, torn apart by the ravenous beasts, their blood staining the ground in dark, crimson patches. There were no survivors, no reinforcements, nothing but the carnage left in the wake of the monster's fury. Ira's heart sank, a weight of despair pressing down on him as he realized the full extent of his mistake. He had led them to their deaths, fallen for the trap that Ninmagus had so carefully laid, and now he stood alone, surrounded by the very creatures that had slaughtered his men. The beasts sensed his moment of distraction, and they lunged, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Ira barely had time to react as a leopard sprang at him, its claws raking across his chest, tearing through his armor and drawing blood. He staggered back, pain flaring in his side. But he did not fall. He could not fall. Not now. Not when everything depended on him. With a roar that echoed across the battlefield, Ira swung the Blaze Frost celestial sword in a wide, sweeping arc, releasing a wave of cold that radiated outward in all directions. The air crackled with frost, the ground freezing beneath the feet of the beasts as the cold intensified to a level that even they could not withstand. The first layer of ice formed around Ira, a barrier that sent the nearest beasts skidding back as they attempted to breach it. But Ira did not stop. He knew that a single layer would not be enough to hold them back for long. He concentrated, channeling every ounce of his strength and willpower into the Blaze Frost celestial sword. The blade responded to his command, humming with a fierce, ancient power as he drove it into the earth. A second layer of ice erupted from the ground, thicker and colder than the first. The temperature dropped sharply, the frost spreading out from Ira's position in a jagged, spiraling pattern. The beasts hesitated, their instincts screaming at them to retreat from the unnatural cold that threatened to freeze them where they stood. But the dark magic of Ninmagus compelled them forward, overriding their fear with a relentless drive to kill. The lions and tigers lunged at the barrier, their claws scraping against the ice with a sound that was more like metal on metal than flesh on ice. The cold was seeping into their bones, slowing their movements, but they pressed on, driven by the dark force that bound them. Ira could see the frost creeping over their fur, turning it white as the ice began to claim them. But the beasts were too many, their numbers overwhelming. The second layer of ice was already cracking under the strain, spiderweb fractures spreading out from the points where the creatures were attacking it. Ira could feel the pressure mounting, the cold demanding more from him, more than he had ever given before. He clenched his jaw, pushing through the pain that gnawed at his bones, and raised the Blaze Frost celestial sword high above his head. The blade glowed with an ethereal light, the cold aura surrounding it intensifying until the very air seemed to freeze in place. Ira knew this was his last chance. If he failed now, Babylon would fall, and with it, everything he had fought to protect. With a final, desperate cry, Ira brought the sword down with all his strength, driving it into the earth with a force that shook the ground. The impact sent a shockwave of cold energy radiating outward, freezing everything in its path. The ground buckled, the ice erupting in jagged spikes that shot up from the earth, impaling the beasts that had come too close. A third layer of ice formed around Ira, thicker and stronger than the first two combined. The cold was so intense that it burned, the frostbite spreading like wildfire through the ranks of the beasts. Those closest to Ira were caught in the shockwave, their bodies encased in ice, before they even had a chance to react. The frozen forms of lions, tigers, and leopards littered the ground, their eyes still glowing with that unholy light even as the life was extinguished from them. But still more came. The lesser beasts hesitated, but a new wave of monstrous predators, bears, rhinoceroses, and wolves, charged forward, their bulk crashing against the ice barrier with a force that sent tremors through the ground. The ice groaned under the strain, the cracks spreading further, but Ira held firm. He could not afford to falter, not now. The Black Iron Horse, sensing its master's peril, joined the fray with renewed fury. The mighty steed reared up, its hooves striking the ground with the force of an avalanche. The beasts that dared to come near were met with a kick so powerful that it shattered bones and sent them flying through the air. The cold emanating from the horse's breath added to Ira's power, the air around them freezing into a dense fog that obscured their forms, making them appear like specters on the battlefield. The bears, their fur matted with frost, tried to force their way through the barrier, but the cold was too much even for their massive bodies. The frost crept over their limbs, slowing them to a crawl before finally freezing them in place. The rhinoceroses, their thick hides cracking under the cold, charged with a mindless fury, but they too fell victim to the ice, their massive forms crashing to the ground with a final, resounding thud. Ira's vision blurred with exhaustion, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he fought to maintain the barrier. The Blazefrost celestial sword felt like a lead weight in his hand, the cold seeping into his very bones, threatening to consume him. But he could not stop, could not let the beasts break through. He could feel the last of his strength slipping away, the frost spreading up his arms, over his chest, numbing him to the core. But then something shifted. The beasts hesitated, their movements faltering as the cold finally began to take its toll. The dark magic that drove them faltered, unable to withstand the sheer force of the cold that Ira had unleashed. One by one, they began to retreat, their snarls turning to whimpers as they fled from the ice that had claimed so many of their kin. The battlefield grew quiet, the sounds of the retreating beasts fading into the distance. Ira stood alone in the center of a frozen wasteland, the bodies of the slain beasts scattered around him like shattered statues. The ice still clung to his skin, the cold a constant, biting presence that refused to release him. But he had done it. He had held the line, defeated the dark magic of Ninmagus, and protected Babylon. The Black Iron Horse snorted, its breath a plume of frost in the cold air. Ira reached out a trembling hand to steady himself against the steed's flank, his strength nearly spent. The cold had taken its toll on him as well, and he could feel the frostbite creeping through his veins, numbing his limbs, slowing his heartbeat. But he was alive, and that was all that mattered. The three fronts of Ninmagus, the distant wail of a horn signaled the dawn of a new day, but it was a sound that brought no comfort to the people of Babylon. The city that had withstood so much, that had defied the might of Persia time and again, now stood on the brink of ruin. The sky above was heavy with dark clouds, as if mourning the blood that had already been shed and the devastation yet to come. The air was thick with the scent of fear, of death, and of something far older and darker, a malevolence that had been awakened by the dark sorcery of Ninmagus. Ira rode back toward the city, his breath visible in the frigid air, his heart heavy with the weight of the battle that lay ahead. The victory against the beasts had been hard-won, but there was no time to rest. As the Black Iron Horse carried him swiftly toward the walls of Babylon, Ira's keen senses picked up a change in the atmosphere, a vibration in the earth, a distant rumble that set his nerves on edge. And then he heard it, the sound of screams, shrill and desperate, rising from within the heart of Babylon itself. Ira's blood ran cold as he realized what was happening. The city, his home, was under attack from within. Ninmagus had set her trap with cunning and cruelty, creating three fronts that would converge in a symphony of death and destruction. The first front had been the beasts, summoned to delay and, if possible, kill Ira. But the second front, the one that had now revealed itself, was far more insidious. Ninmagus had sent monsters, those grotesque and twisted creatures that defied the laws of nature, to burrow deep beneath the earth and breach the city from below. While Ira and the soldiers had been drawn out to face the Persian army and its bestial allies, these monsters had crept unseen beneath Babylon's mighty walls, emerging in the heart of the city to wreak havoc on the defenseless civilians. The monsters rose from the depths of the earth like the embodiment of nightmare. Their forms were a mockery of life. Hulking brutes with limbs twisted at unnatural angles, their skin a patchwork of scales, fur, and rotting flesh. Their eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light, and their mouths were filled with jagged teeth, dripping with the blood of those they had already claimed. Screams echoed through the narrow streets as the monsters rampaged through the city, tearing down buildings and slaughtering anyone unfortunate enough to cross their path. The soldiers who had remained within the city to protect the civilians fought valiantly, but they were no match for the sheer ferocity of the creatures. The monsters moved with unnatural speed, their strength overwhelming, their hunger insatiable. They crushed soldiers beneath their massive feet, ripped through barricades as if they were paper, and snatched fleeing civilians with their long, twisted arms, dragging them into the shadows where their screams were abruptly cut off. Blood flowed freely through the streets of Babylon, mixing with the dust and rubble of the city that was being torn apart from within. Amidst the chaos, a young soldier, barely more than a boy, stood his ground at a narrow alleyway, his sword trembling in his hand as he faced down one of the monsters. The creature towered over him, its foul breath washing over him like a wave of decay. But before it could strike, the boy felt the ground beneath him tremble, and with a roar, the street cracked open as another monster burst from below, dragging the boy into the abyss before he could even cry out. The massacre was relentless, a whirlwind of death that showed no signs of abating. The people of Babylon, once proud and defiant, were now fleeing in terror, their hopes of survival dwindling with each passing moment. The city that had stood as a beacon of resistance against the Persian Empire was now on the verge of being consumed by the darkness that had been unleashed within its walls. The battle between Ira and Ninmagus. Ira's heart pounded in his chest as he urged the black iron horse onward, racing back toward the city. He could feel the terror that gripped the people of Babylon, their screams cutting through the air like knives. But before he could reach the city gates, a shadow moved in the corner of his vision, a blur of darkness that moved faster than the eye could follow. Instinct screamed at him to raise his defenses, but the attack came too quickly. The black shadow struck him square in the chest with a force that sent him flying from the black iron horse. The world spun around him as he crashed to the ground, the impact driving the breath from his lungs. Pain exploded through his body, and he felt something warm and wet trickle from the corner of his mouth. Blood. The Blaze Frost celestial sword flew from his grasp, skittering across the ground as he struggled to push himself up. But before he could even rise to his knees, the shadow materialized in front of him, coalescing into the form of Ninmagus. She stood tall and regal, her dark robes billowing around her like the wings of a raven, her eyes cold and merciless, locked onto Ira as a smile of triumph curled her lips. This was the third front of her attack, the final piece of her plan. While the beasts and monsters tore Babylon apart, she would deal with Ira herself. Foolish Ira, Ninmagus purred, her voice dripping with mockery. Did you really think you could protect this city from me? Did you think your strength, your sword, could stop the inevitable? Ira gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stand despite the searing pain that racked his body. He reached out with his mind, calling the Blazefrost celestial sword back to his hand. But Ninmagus was faster. With a flick of her wrist, she sent a wave of dark energy crashing into him, throwing him back and away from the sword. You've been a thorn in my side for too long, Ninmagus continued, her voice soft yet filled with venom. But that ends now. Babylon will fall, and you will die knowing you failed to protect the very people who looked up to you as their savior. Ira struggled to focus, his vision blurring as the pain threatened to overwhelm him. But he would not give up. With a surge of willpower, He reached for the Blazefrost celestial sword once more, summoning it with every ounce of strength he had left. The sword flew into his hand, its cold power flooding his body, giving him a brief moment of clarity. He knew he had one chance, one final attack to end this nightmare. With a roar of defiance, he unleashed a wave of ice from the sword, sending it hurtling toward Ninmagus. The cold was absolute, a freezing blast that would have turned any normal foe to ice in an instant. But Ninmagus only laughed, a sound that sent chills down Ira's spine. The ice hit her, but instead of freezing her solid, it shattered against an invisible barrier, a shield of ancient magic that protected her from the bone-chilling cold. Pathetic, she sneered, her eyes gleaming with malice. Did you think your petty tricks could harm me? I am beyond your reach, Ira. You are nothing but a relic of a dying world. Before Ira could react, Ninmagus struck again, her form blurred as she moved with the speed of a shadow, her fist driving into his chest with the force of a battering ram. The impact sent Ira flying back, his body slamming into the ground with a sickening thud. His breath hitched as the pain lanced through him, more intense than anything he had ever felt before. His vision dimmed, and for a moment, he thought he would lose consciousness. But he forced himself to hold on, to stay awake. He had to. There was no one else left to defend Babylon. He struggled to push himself up, but his body refused to obey. He could feel his strength slipping away, his life draining from the wounds Ninmagus had inflicted. Ninmagus loomed over him, her form wreathed in shadows, her eyes alight with triumph. "It's over, Ira," she whispered, her voice filled with cold satisfaction. "Your city will burn, and you will die here, alone and forgotten." Ira's grip on the Blazefrost celestial sword slackened, the cold metal slipping from his grasp as his strength faded. He could feel the life leaving him, the darkness closing in as his vision blurred and dimmed. The world around him grew distant, the sounds of battle and death fading into a dull roar. In his final moments, Ira thought of Bel-Shaltinana, of the city he had fought so hard to protect. He had failed them, failed to keep his promise. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was Ninmagus's cold, mocking smile, the roar of the Black Iron Horse. Ninmagus watched as the life drained from Ira's eyes, her victory complete. She had done it. She had killed the one man who had stood in her way, the one who had defied her plans time and again. With Ira dead, there was nothing left to stop her. Babylon would fall, and she would see the city burned to the ground, its people slaughtered or enslaved. But as she turned to give the signal for the Persian army to advance, a sound reached her ears, a sound that made her blood run cold. The Black Iron Horse, Ira's loyal steed, stood over its fallen master, its eyes blazing with a fury that seemed to pierce the very heavens. The air around the mighty beast began to shimmer, a distortion of light and sound as the raw, primal energy that had been locked within it for so long began to surge to the surface. The cold that Ira had once channeled through his sword now pulsed through the Black Iron Horse, the icy mist swirling around it like a living thing. Ninmagus hesitated, her triumphant smile faltering as she felt the shift in the air. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, a low, rumbling vibration that grew steadily stronger. She could sense the power gathering, a power that she had not anticipated, a power that defied her control. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed her mind as she realized that Ira's death had not ended the battle. It had only unleashed something far more terrifying. The Black Iron Horse reared back, its massive hooves crashing down onto the earth with a force that sent shockwaves through the ground. The sound that followed was not the cry of a mere animal, but a roar that reverberated through the very fabric of reality, a sound so primal, so ancient, that it seemed to call forth the fury of the gods themselves. It was a roar of rage, of grief, of defiance, and it echoed across the battlefield, carrying with it a power that shook the souls of all who heard it. The Persian soldiers, who had been poised to march forward at Ninmagus's command, froze in their tracks, their faces pale with fear. The roar of the Black Iron Horse filled the air, growing louder and louder until it seemed to drown out all other sound. The very sky seemed to darken in response. the clouds swirling as if in sympathy with the beast's grief. Ninmagus clapped her hands over her ears, her expression twisting in pain as the sound assaulted her. The ancient magic that had protected her from Ira's cold now seemed fragile in the face of this new, overwhelming force. Blood began to trickle from her ears, a stark reminder that even she was not immune to the power that had been unleashed. The roar of the Black Iron Horse was not just a sound. It was a force of nature, a wave of raw emotion that swept across the battlefield, driving everything before it. The ground cracked and split beneath the beast's hooves, sending jagged fissures racing toward the Persian army. The soldiers, once so confident in their victory, were now reduced to a panicked, fleeing mob, their discipline shattered by the sheer intensity of the sound that tore at their minds and hearts. Ninmagus staggered back, her vision blurring as the pain in her head grew unbearable. She had not expected this, had not foreseen the power that the Black Iron Horse could wield. In her arrogance, she had believed that with Ira dead, the battle was won. But now she realized that the true threat had always been the bond between Ira and his steed, a bond that even death could not sever. The beast's roar reached a crescendo, a piercing wail that seemed to split the very air. The Persian soldiers fell to their knees, clutching their heads in agony as the sound overwhelmed them. The few who managed to remain standing stumbled backward, their faces twisted in terror as they tried to flee from the source of their torment. But there was no escape. The roar of the Black Iron Horse enveloped them all, a relentless wave of sound and fury that drove them to their knees. The cold that had once been Ira's weapon now radiated from the beast, a wave of icy air that swept across the battlefield, freezing everything in its path. The ground turned to frost beneath the soldiers' feet, their breath crystallizing in the air as the temperature plummeted. Ninmagus tried to summon her magic, to shield herself from the onslaught, but the roar was too powerful, too overwhelming. Her hands trembled as she tried to focus her energy, to create a barrier that would protect her from the force of the sound. But it was no use. The magic slipped through her fingers like sand, dissipating into the air as the roar of the Black Iron Horse drowned out all thought, all will. In a final, desperate attempt to silence the beast, Ninmagus raised her hand and unleashed a blast of dark energy, aiming it directly at the Black Iron Horse. The blast struck the beast squarely in the chest, but instead of weakening it, the energy was absorbed into the swirling vortex of cold and fury that surrounded the horse. The beast's eyes blazed even brighter, its roar intensifying as it fed on the dark magic, turning it into fuel for its wrath. Ninmagus cried out in pain as the feedback from her failed attack sent a shockwave of agony through her body. She staggered backward, her strength failing as the roar of the Black Iron Horse continued to batter her senses. Blood now poured from her ears, her vision darkening as the pain grew too intense to bear. And then, just as it seemed that the roar would tear the very sky apart, it ceased. The sudden silence was deafening, a void that seemed to swallow all sound. Ninmagus fell to her knees, gasping for breath as the world spun around her. Her ears rang with the echoes of the roar, the pain still throbbing in her head like a drumbeat. She had never felt so weak, so vulnerable, and for the first time, a deep, primal fear gripped her heart. She looked up, her vision still blurred, and saw the Black Iron Horse standing over Ira's lifeless body. The beast's eyes no longer blazed with fury, but with a deep, mournful sorrow. The cold that had surrounded it had receded, leaving only a thin layer of frost on the ground. But the power that had been unleashed still lingered in the air, a palpable presence that seemed to hang over the battlefield like a shroud. The Persian army was in disarray, their once proud ranks now reduced to a scattered, broken force. The soldiers who had not fled were on their knees, their faces pale with shock and terror. The beasts that had once been their allies lay frozen in the frost, their bodies encased in ice, their eyes wide with the same fear that gripped the hearts of the living. The voice in the void, in the cold, still darkness of death, Ira drifted. His soul, once tethered to the mortal coil, now floated in an abyss that was neither here nor there. The world he had known, the city of Babylon, the roar of battle, the cold steel of his sword, had all faded away, leaving only silence. It was a silence that pressed in from all sides, a silence that swallowed thought and memory, leaving nothing but a sense of endless, empty drifting. And then, through the void, came a golden light. It was faint at first, a distant glimmer that barely registered in the vast emptiness. But as it grew brighter, the light began to fill Ira's body, warming the coldness that had taken root in his soul. The light was not harsh or blinding, but soft and comforting, like the first rays of dawn breaking through a long, dark night. Within the light, Ira felt something stir, a presence, ancient and wise, that seemed to watch over him with a kind of detached benevolence. The presence was not a being in the physical sense, but an essence, a voice that spoke not with words, but with thoughts and feelings that resonated deep within Ira's core. Ira, the voice called, its tone gentle yet powerful, like the whisper of the wind across a desolate plain. You are not dead, Ira. You are stronger than you think. Ira's soul, disoriented and confused, reached out toward the voice, seeking answers in the void. Who are you? He asked, though the question seemed to dissolve in the vastness around him. Where am I? Why am I here? You are in the space between life and death, the voice responded, its tone unwavering, as if the answer was the simplest truth in existence. But your time is not yet over, Ira. The power within you has not been fully realized. You have the strength to return, to continue your journey. The words resonated within Ira, stirring something deep within him, something that had lain dormant for far too long. He had always known that there was a strength within him, a power that went beyond the physical, but it had always been just out of reach, a whisper at the edge of his consciousness. Now, in this place of infinite possibilities, that power seemed to surge within him, filling the void with its presence. Focus your mind, the voice urged, its tone becoming more insistent. Unleash the power within you. You are more than just a warrior, Ira. You are a force of balance, a protector of worlds, and your journey is far from over. The words echoed through the emptiness, filling Ira with a sense of purpose, of clarity. He had fought for Babylon, had fought to protect those he loved, but there was more at stake than just one city, one battle. The power within him was not just for combat. It was a force that could shape the world, could bend the very fabric of reality to his will. And so Ira focused. He let go of the fear, the pain, the doubt that had plagued him in his final moments. He reached deep within himself, to that place where the cold of the Blazefrost celestial sword met the fire of his spirit, where the strength of the black iron horse melded with the steel of his resolve. The light within him flared brighter, filling the void with its golden glow. And then, in a flash of brilliance, Ira awoke. Ira's resurrection. The battlefield was still, the cold air thick with the aftermath of the chaos that had unfolded. The frozen bodies of Persian soldiers and beasts littered the ground, their forms twisted and shattered by the frost that had claimed them. The black iron horse lay motionless beside Ira, its once fiery eyes now dim, as if the very essence of life had been drained from it. But amidst the stillness, a pulse of golden light began to emanate from Ira's body. His eyes, once closed in death, fluttered open, and a deep breath filled his lungs. The wounds that had marred his flesh, the marks of Nimagus's cruel magic, began to heal, the flesh knitting together as if time itself was reversing. Ira sat up, his mind clear, his body whole once more. The golden light that had filled him in the void now pulsed within him, a steady rhythm that echoed with the strength and power of the voice that had spoken to him. He was not dead. He was more alive than ever before, his soul infused with a power that went beyond the mortal realm. As he rose to his feet, Ira's gaze fell upon the Blazefrost celestial sword, lying a few feet away, its blade glinting with a cold, blue light. The sword seemed to call to him, its presence a beacon that drew him forward. He reached out, and the sword flew into his hand, the cold metal warming at his touch, as if recognizing its true master. A sound, faint at first but growing louder, reached Ira's ears. It was a voice filled with disbelief, with anger, with fear. He turned, his eyes narrowing as he saw Ninmagus standing not far away, her form still shrouded in the dark energy that had once seemed so invincible. But now that energy faltered, flickering like a dying flame. Ninmagus' eyes were wide with shock, her expression one of pure, unadulterated surprise. This was not supposed to happen. Ira was supposed to be dead, his body broken, his spirit crushed. But here he stood, alive and whole, his presence radiating a power that she had never anticipated. "Impossible," Ninmagus hissed, her voice trembling with disbelief. "You were dead. I killed you. How can you be standing before me?" Ira's gaze was cold, unyielding, as he regarded the sorceress who had caused so much pain and suffering. "You underestimated me, Ninmagus," he said, his voice steady, filled with a quiet strength that resonated with the power of the void. "You thought you could control the forces of life and death, but you were wrong. I am more than just a man. I am a force that you cannot hope to defeat." Ninmagus took a step back, her confidence shaken. For the first time, doubt crept into her mind, a doubt that gnawed at her like a festering wound. She had always believed herself to be invincible, her magic unmatched, her power absolute. But now, faced with Ira's resurrection, she realized that she had miscalculated terribly. "This changes nothing," Ninmagus snarled, her voice laced with desperation. "I will still destroy you, Ira. You may have returned from the dead, but I will send you back to the void where you belong." With a flick of her wrist, Ninmagus unleashed a wave of dark energy, the shadows swirling around her like a storm. The magic crackled with malevolent power, the air around her warping and distorting as the energy surged toward Ira. But Ira stood his ground, his eyes locked on the sorceress who had become the embodiment of darkness and despair. As the dark energy closed in, Ira raised the Blazefrost Celestial Sword, the blade glowing with an intense, icy light. The cold that emanated from the sword met the darkness head-on, a clash of forces that sent shockwaves through the air. The frost spread rapidly, consuming the shadows, freezing the dark energy in place before shattering it into 1,000 shards. Ninmagus' eyes widened in horror as her magic crumbled before her, her attack thwarted with ease. She could feel the cold creeping closer, could feel the power of the Blazefrost Celestial Sword growing stronger with each passing moment. This was not supposed to happen. She was the one in control, the one with the power. But now, it seemed as though the very fabric of reality was turning against her. "No," she screamed, her voice filled with fury and fear. "I will not be defeated by you. I am Ninmagus, the master of darkness, the queen of the void. I will not be cast aside like some forgotten shadow." But Ira was relentless. He focused his mind, drawing on the power within him, the power that had been awakened by the voice in the void. With a single fluid motion, he threw the Blazefrost Celestial Sword, the blade spinning through the air with a deadly precision. Ninmagus barely had time to react. The sword hurtled toward her, a streak of icy light that cut through the air with terrifying speed. She tried to dodge, to disappear into the shadows as she had done before, but the sword seemed to follow her, its path unwavering, its target clear. "You cannot escape, Ninmagus," Ira's voice echoed, cold and determined. "You have brought darkness and death to this world, and now you will face the consequences." Ninmagus' heart raced as she felt the sword closing in on her. Desperation clawed at her mind as she tried to summon her magic, to create a shield, to do anything to stop the blade that bore down on her with the force of a vengeful storm. But it was too late. The Blazefrost Celestial Sword struck, its blade piercing through the darkness that surrounded Ninmagus. She let out a scream of pure agony as the cold energy coursed through her, freezing her very soul. But the sword did not stop with just piercing her. The blade, driven by Ira's unyielding will, began to push Ninmagus back, forcing her into the shadows from which she had emerged. The darkness that had once obeyed her every command now recoiled from the cold, shrinking away as the icy light of the Blazefrost Celestial Sword grew brighter, more intense. "No!" Ninmagus shrieked, her voice echoing with desperation and fear. "This cannot be. I am Ninmagus, master of the void. I cannot be defeated by a mere mortal." But the power that Ira had unleashed was far beyond anything Ninmagus could have imagined. The more Ninmagus struggled, the more the sword drove her back, deeper into the shadows, deeper into the darkness that had once been her domain. You cannot escape your fate, Ninmagus. Ira's voice rang out, steady and resolute. You have sown destruction and despair, but your reign ends here. This world will no longer be bound by your darkness. Ninmagus's form began to waver, her once solid figure now flickering like a dying flame as the darkness around her crumbled under the relentless assault of the Blazefrost celestial sword. The shadows that had once given her power now seemed to turn against her, pulling her deeper into the void from which she had emerged. Her screams grew fainter, more distant, as the icy light of the sword consumed her. The darkness that surrounded Ninmagus swirled like a storm, a vortex of shadow that twisted and writhed as if trying to resist the inevitable. But the Blazefrost celestial sword continued to push forward, its cold light cutting through the darkness, banishing it with every inch it advanced. Ninmagus, the once feared sorceress, found herself being driven back into the very abyss that had birthed her. As the last remnants of her form began to dissolve into the void, Ninmagus's voice echoed one final time, filled with a despair that resonated through the empty air. This cannot be. I am eternal. I am Ninmagus. The ruin of Babylon. The smoke that rose above the city of Babylon was thick and acrid, mingling with the morning mist to create a shroud that hid the horrors beneath. The once proud and mighty city, a beacon of civilization and strength, now lay in ruin, its streets choked with the debris of war and the blood of the innocent. The battle that had raged through the night had left nothing untouched. No corner of the city spared from the destruction wrought by the monsters that Ninmagus had unleashed. Ira rode toward Babylon with a singular focus, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what awaited him. The black iron horse, sensing its master's urgency, galloped at a speed that defied reason, its hooves striking the ground with the force of a storm. The Blazefrost celestial sword, now a beacon of icy light in the gloom, was raised high, its cold power already spreading out before them, freezing the very air as they rode. As Ira neared the city's gates, the sounds of battle and the screams of the dying reached his ears, and a cold dread settled in his chest. The monsters were inside the city, their savage rampage unchecked, their bloodlust unquenched. He urged the black iron horse onward, the two of them moving as one, their combined will driving them forward with a ferocity that mirrored the storm that was gathering within Ira's heart. The gates of Babylon, once a symbol of the city's invincibility, now hung open, the heavy doors splintered and shattered by the force of the monster's assault. Ira rode through them without slowing, his eyes scanning the chaos before him. Everywhere he looked, there was destruction, homes reduced to rubble, streets littered with the bodies of soldiers and civilians alike, and the monsters, those twisted abominations, feasting on the carnage. Ira's grip tightened on the Blazefrost celestial sword, and with a wordless cry, he brought the blade down in a sweeping arc. A wave of freezing cold surged from the sword, rushing toward the nearest cluster of monsters. The creatures, sensing the danger too late, turned to flee, but the icy wave was faster. It swept over them, freezing them solid where they stood, their grotesque forms encased in crystal-like ice that glittered eerily in the faint light. Without pausing, Ira urged the black iron horse onward, riding deeper into the heart of the city. His sword flashed again and again, each swing sending out waves of cold that froze the monsters in their tracks, turning them into statues of ice that shattered with the force of the sword's impact. The streets of Babylon, once filled with life, were now a battleground of frost and blood, the monsters falling one by one beneath the relentless onslaught of Ira's fury. But despite his efforts, the city continued to burn. The monsters, though diminished in number, still wreaked havoc wherever they could, their claws tearing through stone and flesh with equal ease. Ira could see the flames rising from the buildings, could hear the cries of those who had yet to fall, and he knew that he was running out of time. The palace was still standing, but for how much longer? The monsters were closing in on it, driven by some primal instinct to destroy the very heart of Babylon. The palace under siege, Inside the palace, Nabonidus stood at the edge of the great hall, his hands trembling as he watched the approach of the monsters. The ornate doors, carved with the stories of Babylon's victories and glories, now shook with each impact as the creatures outside pounded against them. The walls, once adorned with the treasures of the empire, now seemed to close in, the weight of the impending doom pressing down on all within. Nabonidus had seen much in his time: wars, betrayals, the rise and fall of empires. But nothing had prepared him for this. The monsters were unlike any enemy he had faced before, their savagery and strength unmatched by any force of man. He had sent his best soldiers to defend the palace, but they had fallen, one by one, their bodies now lying in twisted heaps outside the doors. The king's breath came in shallow gasps, his mind racing as he tried to think of some way to stop the inevitable. But there was nothing left. No army to call upon, no fortress to retreat to. All that remained was the palace, and even that would not stand for long. The monsters were coming, and with them, the end of Babylon. Just as the first of the monsters broke through the palace doors, a blast of freezing wind tore through the hall, sending shards of ice and debris flying in all directions. The monster, a hulking brute with claws like daggers, froze mid-lunge, its snarl turning to a gasp of surprise as the cold overtook it. Its body crystallized, the ice spreading rapidly until the creature was nothing more than a grotesque statue, its twisted features locked in a final expression of rage. Nabonidus's eyes widened in shock as Ira burst into the hall, the Blazefrost celestial sword raised high, its blade glowing with an ethereal light. The black iron horse reared up on its hind legs, its breath billowing out in plumes of frost, before charging forward, carrying Ira straight into the midst of the remaining monsters. The creatures, sensing the power that radiated from Ira, hesitated, their predatory instincts suddenly overcome by fear. But Ira showed no mercy. He swung the sword in a wide arc, the cold wave that followed freezing the monsters where they stood, their bodies shattering into 1,000 pieces as the black iron horse trampled over them. Nabonidus watched in awe as Ira moved with a grace and power that seemed almost otherworldly. The monsters that had seemed invincible moments before were now nothing more than frozen carcasses, their forms reduced to icy rubble beneath the relentless assault of Ira's sword. But despite the victory in the palace, Ira could see that the battle was far from over. The city was still under siege. The monsters that remained were still causing chaos and destruction in the streets. The palace may have been saved, but Babylon itself was still in peril. With a final swing of the Blazefrost celestial sword, Ira dispatched the last of the monsters inside the palace, the cold wave from the sword freezing the creature before it could even take another breath. The hall was silent once more, the only sound the crackling of ice as the frozen remains of the monsters began to thaw. Ira turned to Nabonidus, who stood trembling at the far end of the hall. The king's face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and relief. Ira could see the toll that the battle had taken on him, could see the fear that still gripped his heart. But there was no time for comfort, no time for words of reassurance. The battle was not yet won. "We need to secure the city," Ira said, his voice firm, though the weariness was clear in his eyes. "The monsters may be retreating, but they will regroup. We must find the remaining soldiers and defend what's left of Babylon." Nabonidus nodded, though his hand still shook. "Ira, I don't know how much more we can endure. The city, it's in ruins." Ira looked out at the devastation, at the flames still burning in the distance, at the smoke that choked the sky. He could feel the sadness creeping into his heart, the weight of the lives lost, the homes destroyed. But he could not afford to give in to despair. Not now. "We'll rebuild," Ira said, though his voice was tinged with sorrow. "But first, we must survive. The last stand." With a renewed sense of urgency, Ira and Nabonidus moved quickly through the palace, gathering the remaining soldiers and preparing for what was to come. The soldiers, though battered and weary, rallied at the sight of Ira, their spirits lifted by the presence of the man who had become their beacon of hope. Ira led them out of the palace, the black iron horse moving swiftly through the streets as they sought out the pockets of resistance that still remained. The monsters, those that had not been frozen by the Blaze Frost celestial sword, were regrouping, their twisted forms moving through the city like a plague, searching for any signs of life to snuff out. But Ira was relentless. Each swing of the Blaze Frost celestial sword sent out waves of cold that froze the monsters in their tracks, turning their ferocity into brittle ice that shattered beneath the hooves of the Black Iron Horse. The soldiers fought beside him, their swords and spears flashing in the dim light, cutting down the creatures that dared to stand against them. The battle raged on, the sound of clashing steel and the roars of the monsters filling the air. The streets, once filled with the noise of daily life, were now a battlefield, the ground slick with blood and ice. The buildings, once proud and strong, were reduced to rubble, the homes of the people of Babylon now nothing more than hollow shells. But slowly, inexorably, the tide began to turn. The monsters, sensing that the tide was against them, began to retreat, their once unstoppable advance now faltering in the face of Ira's unyielding resolve. The cold that emanated from the Blaze Frost celestial sword was like a wall of ice, driving the creatures back, freezing them where they stood. The streets of Babylon, once filled with terror, were now littered with the frozen remains of the monsters that had sought to destroy the city. The soldiers, though exhausted, pushed forward, their spirits lifted by the sight of Ira leading the charge. They fought with renewed vigor, their swords flashing in the dim light as they carved through the last remnants of the monstrous horde. The once unstoppable tide of destruction began to falter, and then, slowly but surely, it broke. Ira, his resolve hardened by the devastation around him, continued to lead the charge. Each swing of the Blaze Frost celestial sword unleashed a cold so intense that it froze the very air around it, creating a barrier of frost that the monsters could not penetrate. The creatures that had once seemed invincible now fell before him, like brittle leaves in the wind, their grotesque forms shattering as the cold claimed them. The Black Iron Horse moved with a speed and grace that belied its size, its hooves striking the ground with a force that sent shockwaves through the earth. It seemed almost as if the horse understood the gravity of the situation, its every movement in perfect sync with Ira's commands. Together, they were an unstoppable force, a storm of ice and steel that swept through the streets of Babylon, purging it of the darkness that had taken hold. As they pushed deeper into the city, Ira's mind raced. The destruction was overwhelming. The city he had once called home reduced to little more than rubble and ash. But he could not afford to dwell on the loss. Not yet. The monsters still roamed the streets, and as long as they did, there was work to be done. Suddenly, a shriek pierced the air, a sound so raw and filled with terror that it cut through the chaos like a blade. Ira turned his head sharply, his eyes narrowing as he tried to locate the source. It came from somewhere to his right, beyond the smoldering ruins of a once great building. Without hesitation, Ira spurred the Black Iron Horse in that direction, his grip on the Blaze Frost celestial sword tightening. The sight that met him as he rounded the corner was one that would haunt him for the rest of his days. A group of civilians, women, children, and the elderly, had taken refuge in what remained of a large stone structure, perhaps once a temple or a marketplace. The walls were partially collapsed, leaving them exposed and vulnerable. A massive monster, larger than any Ira had faced that day, was bearing down on them, its maw wide open, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Its skin was a patchwork of scales and matted fur, its eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger. The civilians screamed as the beast lunged, its claws outstretched to tear them apart. But before it could reach them, Ira was there, his sword raised high. With a shout that echoed through the ruins, he brought the Blaze Frost celestial sword down in a mighty arc. The blade connected with the monster's head, and a shockwave of cold erupted from the point of impact. The creature's roar of rage turned into a howl of agony as the cold spread rapidly through its body, freezing its flesh and bone. It tried to claw at Ira, but the movement was sluggish, its limbs stiffening as the ice took hold. Within seconds, the monster was frozen solid, its massive form encased in a thick layer of frost. Ira didn't stop to admire his handiwork. He urged the black iron horse forward, pushing past the frozen beast and placing himself between the civilians and any remaining threats. His eyes scanned the surroundings, searching for any sign of movement, any hint of danger. But for the moment, it seemed that the area was clear. The civilians stared at him with wide, fearful eyes, their bodies trembling from the cold and the terror of what they had just witnessed. Ira turned to them, his expression softening slightly as he lowered his sword. "You're safe now," he said, his voice calm despite the turmoil raging inside him. "But you need to get out of the city. Find somewhere to hide until this is over." One of the women, her face streaked with dirt and tears, nodded shakily. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Thank you, Ira." Ira nodded once, then turned his attention back to the task at hand. There was no time to waste. He needed to ensure that the remaining monsters were dealt with before they could cause any more harm. With a final glance at the civilians, he spurred the black iron horse onward, moving deeper into the city. The aftermath of the battle. The battle continued for what felt like hours, but in reality, it was over much more quickly. The last of the monsters, sensing that their end was near, had fled the city, burrowing into the ground and vanishing into the shadows from whence they had come. The streets of Babylon, once filled with the sounds of life and prosperity, were now eerily silent. The only noise the crackling of flames and the distant wails of the wounded. Ira stood at the center of the devastation, his chest heaving with exhaustion, his mind numb from the horrors he had witnessed. The Blazefrost celestial sword, still gripped tightly in his hand, no longer glowed with its usual intensity. The cold within it subdued, as if in mourning for the city that had been all but destroyed. The black iron horse, its flanks streaked with blood and frost, stood beside him, its head lowered. The bond between them, forged in battle and strengthened by their shared purpose, was now tinged with sorrow. They had fought valiantly, had done all they could, but the cost had been too high. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the full extent of the destruction became clear. Babylon, once a jewel of the ancient world, was now a landscape of rubble and ash. The great walls that had once protected the city were breached and crumbling, the homes of its people reduced to little more than charred remains. The streets, once bustling with activity, were now littered with the frozen corpses of monsters and the shattered lives of those who had fallen. Ira's heart ached as he looked upon the ruin before him. The city he had sworn to protect, the place that had once been a symbol of strength and resilience, was now a graveyard. The echoes of the battle still lingered in the air, a haunting reminder of the lives that had been lost and the devastation that had been wrought. As the sun began to rise, its light weak and pale through the lingering smoke, Ira dismounted the black iron horse. His legs felt heavy, his body weighed down by the exhaustion of battle and the grief that clung to him like a shroud. He sheathed the Blazefrost celestial sword, its icy glow dimming as it rested at his side. The survivors began to emerge from their hiding places, their faces etched with shock and disbelief as they surveyed the ruins of their once proud city. Children clung to their mothers, their wide eyes filled with fear and confusion. The elderly hobbled forward, their steps unsteady as they sought out familiar faces among the debris. The soldiers who had fought beside Ira now stood in silence, their weapons lowered, their expressions hollow. Nabonidus approached Ira, his face drawn with fatigue and sorrow. The king's regal bearing was diminished, his robes torn and bloodied, his crown lost in the chaos. Yet there was a determination in his eyes, a glimmer of hope that refused to be extinguished. "Ira," Nabonidus said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of their shared loss. "We owe you our lives. Without you, the city would have fallen completely. But there is nothing left. Babylon is not just its walls," Ira replied, his voice steady despite the sorrow that gnawed at him. "It's the people. Those who survive, they will rebuild. We will rebuild." Nabonidus nodded, though the doubt in his eyes was clear. "But at what cost? So many are dead. So much has been lost." Ira looked around at the destruction, at the bodies strewn across the streets, at the smoldering ruins of what had once been homes and temples. The weight of the loss pressed down on him, but he knew that he could not allow it to crush him. Babylon had fallen, but it had not been destroyed. As long as there were people willing to fight for it, to rebuild it, there was still hope. "We'll mourn our dead," Ira said, his voice firm. "But we cannot let this defeat us. Babylon has endured for centuries. It will endure this." The king's eyes searched Ira's face, and for a moment, he seemed to draw strength from the younger man's resolve. "You are right," Nabonidus said, though the words seemed to cost him. "We must be strong, for the sake of those who are left." Together, they walked through the ruined streets, gathering the survivors and organizing the remnants of the city's defenses. The soldiers who had survived the battle began to help clear the debris, searching for any who might still be alive beneath the rubble. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and death, but amid the destruction, there was a glimmer of hope, a determination to survive, to rebuild, to honor the memory of those who had fallen. The weight of loss. As the day wore on, the full extent of the devastation became apparent. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to ash, their streets choked with the bodies of the dead. The great temples of the gods, once the pride of Babylon, now lay in ruins, their stone columns toppled, their sanctuaries desecrated by the monster's rampage. The river that had once brought life to the city now ran dark with blood, its waters fouled by the bodies of the fallen. But despite the overwhelming loss, there was a resilience in the people of Babylon. Those who had survived the night's horrors banded together, helping each other to bury the dead, to salvage what they could from the wreckage, to begin the long, arduous process of rebuilding. They were a people who had known hardship before, who had faced the worst the world could throw at them, and had survived. This time would be no different. Ira moved among them, offering what comfort and aid he could, though his heart was heavy with grief. Every face he saw, every body he passed, was a reminder of the cost of the battle, of the lives that had been lost in the defense of the city. He had fought with all his strength, had given everything he had, but it had not been enough to save them all. The guilt gnawed at him, a constant reminder of his own limitations. He found himself drawn back to the palace, to the hall where he had faced the last of the monsters. The bodies of the creatures lay where they had fallen, their twisted forms now shattered ice. The air was still cold, the frost from the blaze frost celestial soared lingering in the shadows. Ira stood in the center of the room, his thoughts heavy as he surveyed the aftermath. It was here, in this very hall, that the fate of Babylon had been decided. He had saved the palace, had driven the monsters back, but the victory felt hollow. The city was in ruins, its people broken. The war had been won, but the cost had been too great. A soft sound drew Ira's attention, and he turned to see Bel-Shaltinanna standing in the doorway. Her once pristine robes were stained with ash and blood, her face pale and drawn, but there was a strength in her eyes, a quiet determination that mirrored Ira's own. "Ira," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of their shared grief. "The people, they are looking to you. They need someone to lead them, to show them that there is still hope." Ira met her gaze, his heart heavy with the burden of leadership. He had never sought power, had never desired to be a leader. He was a warrior, a protector. But now, in the aftermath of the battle, he found himself thrust into a role he had never wanted. "They need you as well," Ira replied, his voice quiet. "You are the daughter of Nabonidus, the one they look to for guidance. Together, we can help them rebuild." Bel-Shaltinanna nodded, though there was a sadness in her eyes that mirrored Ira's own. "We have lost so much," she said, her voice tinged with sorrow. "But we cannot let this defeat us. We must be strong, for those who are left." Ira reached out, taking her hand in his. Her fingers were cold, trembling slightly, but she did not pull away. Together, they stood in the ruined hall, two figures in the midst of the devastation, united in their determination to rebuild what had been lost. The dawn of rebuilding, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ruined city. The people of Babylon gathered in the central square. The fires that had raged throughout the day were finally beginning to die down. the smoke rising into the evening sky like the ghosts of the dead. The square, once a place of celebration and commerce, was now a gathering place for the survivors, a place where they could mourn their losses and find comfort in each other's presence. Ira and Nabonidus stood before the crowd, their faces marked by exhaustion and grief, but there was a resolve in their eyes, a determination to see Babylon rise from the ashes, to honor the memory of those who had fallen by ensuring that the city would endure. "We have faced a great darkness," Nabonidus began, his voice carrying across the square. "Our city has been ravaged, our people slaughtered, but we are not defeated. Babylon will rise again, stronger than before. We will rebuild, brick by brick, stone by stone. We will honor the memory of those who have fallen by ensuring that their sacrifices were not in vain." The people listened in silence, their faces a mix of grief and determination. They had lost so much, but they were not broken. They were survivors, and they would see Babylon rise again. Ira stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "We have fought and bled for this city," he said, his voice steady and strong. "We have lost loved ones, friends, family, but we are still here. And as long as we stand together, as long as we refuse to give in to despair, Babylon will endure." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, a sign that the people of Babylon were ready to begin the long, difficult task of rebuilding. They were a proud people, and they would not be defeated by the darkness that had threatened to consume them. As the crowd began to disperse, Ira remained in the square, his thoughts heavy. The battle was over, but the war was not won. There were still threats out there, still forces of darkness that would seek to destroy all that they had fought to protect. But for now, they had a moment of peace, a chance to rebuild and to mourn their losses. Bel-Shaltinanna joined him, her presence a comforting one. Together, they looked out over the city, at the ruins that had once been their home, and they knew that there was much work to be done. But they were not alone. "We will rebuild," Ira said quietly, his voice filled with determination. "For Babylon, for those we have lost, we will rebuild." Bel-Shaltinanna nodded, her hand still resting in his. As the last light of the day faded and the stars began to emerge in the night sky, Ira and Bel-Shaltinanna stood side by side, their hearts heavy with the weight of their loss, but also filled with a determination to see Babylon rise again. The city may have been ravaged, but it was not defeated. And as long as there were those willing to fight for it, to rebuild it, Babylon would endure. The night was quiet, the fires finally extinguished, and in that stillness, there was a sense of hope. The darkness had come, but it had not won. Babylon would rise again, and its people would see to it that the city would stand strong once more.